Hello, my name is Claire McGann and I work in the Department for English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. Today I'm going to begin our session together by introducing my approach to studying works of literature. That'll take about 5 minutes. Then I'm going to give you some questions to think about independently for a few minutes. Our session together will continue like this, with me talking for a little while and then us having a short break for you to work on a task. The aim of this session is to get you thinking about Macbeth in new and creative ways, and to introduce you to some of the analytical approaches and ideas you might encounter should you choose to study English literature at university. As an academic, my own research focuses on the early modern period of English history and literature. You might ask, what is the early modern period? Well, the early modern period is often defined as the 200-year span of English history that stretches from the year 1500 to the year 1700. This period of time includes a lot of interesting and foundational events in English history, some of which I've summarised for you on this slide. The early modern period includes the reigns of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I, who is pictured on this slide wearing a fashionably tall Capitan hat. The early modern era also covers the period of the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, during which King Charles I was famously beheaded. At the very end of the early modern period comes the Restoration, when the monarchy was restored with King Charles II, who is pictured on this slide showing off his rather voluminous wig and white-stockinged legs for all to admire. But the early modern period didn't just see a series of questionable innovations in fashion. This era was also a period of great literary creativity and change. As you know, Shakespeare wrote his plays in early modern England. For example, scholars believe that the tragedy Macbeth was written and performed in the year 1606, right in the middle of the early modern era. I would describe my approach to studying the literature of the early modern period as historicist. A historicist analysis of a literary work is a reading that places particular emphasis on a text's historical context. In short, I would argue that every play, poem, or novel is influenced by the time period in which it was written. I would argue that texts reflect and respond to the problems, prejudices, debates, and ideas that were present in the society when they were written. So, if you sat down to write a poem on the 1st of July 2020, the words that you would use, your tone, your metaphors, even your rhyme scheme would all be influenced by the fact that you're writing that poem on the 1st of July 2020. Meanwhile, if you had sat down to write that poem on the 1st of July 1620, it would have turned out to be a very different poem. One key reason why it would be a very different poem is because you'd be writing it in a very different way, using very different equipment. If you were an early modern writer, you'd be handwriting your poem using a quill and ink. On this slide, I've included a wonderful portrait of a Dutch merchant who is staring quizzically at the viewer from his cluttered writing desk. This early modern man is holding a white quill, which would probably have been made from a goose feather, whittled down to form a nib at the end. In order to write, that quill would be dipped into a bottle of ink, like the open ink pot that is pictured in the bottom left-hand corner of this portrait. That ink would probably have been made at home, using recipes that contain things like iron, tree bark, alcohol, even children's urine. After the words were written on the page with the ink and quill, you'd have to scatter the wet text with a sandy powder known as pounce or talc to help it dry. A shaker containing this drying substance is also depicted on the desk in front of the writer in this portrait. Behind the merchant, sheets of correspondence can be seen bundled together and hanging on the walls. Thus, as an early modern writer, you couldn't really compose text whilst on the move, because you needed this range of tools and pieces of equipment. Just look at all the objects that this 16th century man has on the desk in front of him. In contrast, as a poet in 2020, you could write whilst on the move by using your phone, your laptop, or a biro on the back of a bus ticket. As a researcher, I'm really interested in analysing the impact of these changing circumstances and technologies of writing. In particular, I want to know how we might interpret and understand words differently if they are communicated to us in different formats. For example, do we understand a novel differently if we read it as an e-book rather than in a physical paperback form? Might our impression of a poem change if it was printed in red ink rather than black ink? In today's seminar, we're going to think about some of these issues and these questions together. We're going to explore the semantic implications of textual medium and form and consider how these play in Shakespeare's Macbeth. As a starter exercise, just to get our brains warmed up, I want you to have a think about the following scenario. I want you to imagine that someone is telling you a piece of exciting news which could transform your life for the better. Would you prefer to A, hear that news in person, or B, read that news in a letter? How might each of these different modes of communication change the way you feel? How might these formats change the experience of the person telling you the good news? And why might they pick one format over the other? I'm going to ask you to pause the lecture now for 5 minutes to give you a chance to think about these questions independently and write down some of your ideas. This is just a starter task to get you thinking about some of the ideas that we're going to connect back to Macbeth very soon. So pause the presentation for 5 minutes now and we'll meet again soon. So, oral or written communication? I wonder which of those two options you decided you would prefer. For some of you, the spoken word might have appealed the most. Hearing some good news in person would allow you to celebrate with the messenger. You could hug them or do a silly victory dance together in your living room. You would also have an opportunity to immediately ask any follow-up questions and to make plans together about how to celebrate. Perhaps you might only believe the good news if you hear it from someone's lips. In person, you can verify that the messenger is being truthful and honest by checking their face for signs of lying, and perhaps gauge their own response to the news. However, others in our group today might have preferred to receive their good news in a written letter. Reading information allows you to take time to process it and reread it at your leisure. When you receive a letter, you can read it in private and have your initial reaction alone. You can also do a silly happy dance in your living room unseen, and then respond to the messenger more calmly and professionally later. Perhaps you might believe good news more if you can read it for yourself. Do you think things appear more official when someone has bothered to commit them to pen and paper? Certainly with a letter, you have some physical proof that you can keep and refer back to or show to others if need be. So let's keep these thoughts about the semantic implications of different modes of textual communication in mind as we turn now to look at Macbeth. I'd like to draw our attention to Act 1, Scene 5 of Shakespeare's play. At the very start of this scene, the audience is introduced to the character of Lady Macbeth for the very first time. Lady Macbeth walks onto the stage carrying a letter, which was written to her by her husband Macbeth. She then begins to read that letter out loud. As an audience member, we quickly realise that in this letter, Macbeth is telling his wife about the events that we have just seen taking place on the stage. Macbeth tells Lady Macbeth that the Weird sisters have addressed him as Thane of Cawdor before he had even received that title, and that they have prophesied he will become king. After she finishes reading aloud from the letter, Lady Macbeth then utters a soliloquy that is composed as if she is talking to her husband. We hear her imagining telling Macbeth that he is too kind and that he lacks the resolve and ambition to carry out the dirty work that she believes will be necessary for obtaining the golden round of the crown he has been promised. I'm going to read the first 28 lines of Act 1, Scene 5 aloud now, and I'd like you to follow along in your own copy of the play, or with the text that I've printed on these 2 slides. As I recite these lines from the play, you might want to practice reading the lines aloud with me. But most importantly, as I read, I want you to try to picture how an actor on stage might deliver these lines, holding the letter in their hand. Scene 5, Inverness, Macbeth's castle. Enter Lady Macbeth, reading a letter. Lady Macbeth reads, "They met me in the day of success, and I have learned by the perfectest report they have more in them than mortal knowledge. When I burned in desire to question them further, they made themselves air, into which they vanished. Whilst I stood wrapped in the wonder of it, came missives from the king, who all hailed me Thane of Cawdor, by which title before these weird sisters saluted me, and referred me to the coming on of time with, Hail, King that shalt be. This have I thought good to deliver thee, my dearest partner of greatness, that thou mightst not lose the dues of rejoicing by being ignorant of what greatness is promised thee. Lay it to thy heart, and farewell." Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be, what thou art promised, yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. What thou wouldst highly, thou wouldst wholly, wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Thou'st have, great Glamis, that which cries, thus thou must do, if thou have it, and that which rather thou doest fear to do than wishes should be undone. Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valour of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. Now there's an awful lot that we could analyse together in these lines. However, I'd like to focus on the particular dynamic introduced by the letter in this scene. Here, the letter acts as a dramatic device and a physical prop on the stage. I'm going to ask you to pause the tape again in a minute to give you a chance to analyse the role of this letter as prop and device. As you do so, I'd like you to think about a set of questions printed on the next slide. The questions that I'd like you to consider during this independent task are: 1. What does Macbeth's letter reveal about his character, and what does Lady Macbeth's reaction to it reveal about hers? 2. Why do you think Macbeth writes to his wife to tell her the news, rather than waiting until they are together to tell her face to face? 3. Why do you think Shakespeare chose to write this letter scene rather than depicting a face-to-face conversation between husband and wife? Finally, Lady Macbeth's very first lines in the play are her husband's words. How might this shape the audience's impression of her? I'm going to ask you to pause the seminar for 10 minutes now. During these 10 minutes of independent work, I'd like you to write down a few sentences in response to each of the questions listed on this slide. You will need to reread Act 1, Scene 5, lines 1 to 28, which were printed on the previous slides and that I just read out. This task will help you to develop and practice your close reading skills. So pause the presentation for 10 minutes now, and then we will resume and discuss the lines from the play together. Welcome back. First, let's discuss question 1 together. Some of you might have observed that this letter evidences Macbeth's love for his wife. Here, in the private space of the letter, he describes her as my dearest partner of greatness. This hyperbolic phrase is filled with admiring superlatives. For Macbeth, his wife is the dearest and a partner of greatness. Moreover, he suggests that he is most excited about the news he has received from the Weird Sisters because it will mean more greatness for his wife. Indeed, Macbeth claims to be writing to let Macbeth know what more greatness is promised thee as quickly as possible, so that she can rejoice in the knowledge she will one day be queen. However, Lady Macbeth seems uninterested in what Macbeth's prophesied promotion might mean for her. She does not seem to rejoice as her husband predicted, and she does not spend time fantasizing about the riches, power, and greatness that she will possess as wife to the king. Instead, her speech focuses entirely on her husband, just as his letter focused on her. Lady Macbeth clearly admires her husband. Indeed, in her response, she describes Macbeth as being full of the milk of human kindness. That's normally considered a good thing. And yet she also sounds exasperated by his inability to take the action that she deems necessary. She states that he is not without ambition, but is without the illness should attend it, and predicts that he will not play false to gain what he wants to win. Thus, in this scene with the letter, we discover a couple who clearly admire each other, and we sense Macbeth's desire to please and elevate his wife through his own promotion. However, Lady Macbeth reacts to this news in a way that Macbeth does not seem to predict in his correspondence. She does not rejoice in her soliloquy, but instead begins to plot sinful actions. Perhaps this letter scene suggests some flaw in this couple's communication and understanding of each other. Let's skip now to question 3. Why did Shakespeare decide to use the device of a letter to communicate this news from husband to wife? And what semantic effect does the letter have on the play and its audience? Well, this letter format gives us an opportunity to witness Lady Macbeth's private and immediate reaction to the news Macbeth receives from the witches. If Macbeth was in front of her, telling her this news face to face, one wonders whether she might have reacted rather differently. Instead, by reading this letter alone, Lady Macbeth is entirely free to let her thoughts fly, and she's able to turn, almost immediately, towards notions of sin. Because she is reading the prophecies alone, there is no second person there to counteract her or to deny her belief that Macbeth's kindness impedes him from the golden round of the crown. The image I've included on this slide shows an artist's impression of Lady Macbeth reading the letter. In this painting, it is clear to the viewer that the engrossed, isolated letter reader is liable to fall victim to that lurking devilish figure waiting to offer her a dagger to her right. This is a painting that also articulates early modern attitudes to women. During this period, many believed that women were more susceptible to sin and that they could fall victim to the devil's temptations if left unattended by their husbands. In this scene in the play, Macbeth is absent, and he communicates with his wife only by letter. This gives Lady Macbeth the freedom to plot and scheme and leaves her exposed to sinful temptation. Finally, what did you think about the fact that Lady Macbeth's very first lines in this play are not actually her own? Her first words to the audience are written by her husband, and we might suggest that this places her in a rather subordinate position. Her place in this play's hierarchy is contingent upon her relationship to the drama's main character, Macbeth. Perhaps, therefore, this stage letter foreshadows in some way Lady Macbeth's ultimate dependency upon her husband. The literary critic Alan Stewart has written about this letter scene in Macbeth, and I'd like you to study his critical interpretation and analysis of this scene now. Reading the ideas of critics can help us to develop our own interpretations of literary works. So, I'm going to ask you to pause the presentation again for 5 minutes to allow you to read through Stewart's thoughts yourself and to have a think about them independently. I'd like you to consider the following questions. Does Stewart articulate things here that you also felt and thought about this scene? Why might Shakespeare have wanted to create the two-in-one effect Stewart describes in this quotation? And does that two-in-one effect have consequences for the rest of the play? You'll find the quotation from Stewart printed on this slide. So I'm going to ask you to pause the presentation now for 5 minutes and then restart it, and we'll meet again. So, Stewart argues that the presence of the letter on the stage enables a kind of two-in-one effect. The letter device means that Lady Macbeth appears and speaks on the stage at the same time as her husband. She talks to us using her husband's words, which establishes their very close and intimate relationship from the very start of the play. It is possible, I think, in this play for us to blame the murders, bloodshed and sins that take place later on Lady Macbeth's own bloodthirsty nature and ambitions. However, I would argue it is notable that in Lady Macbeth's first appearance on the stage, we are encouraged to regard husband and wife as one and the same. They are merged together here and speak with the same voice. As such, perhaps the play is warning us not to regard the two characters as separate, but to recognise their shared guilt and responsibility. On this slide, I've included an image of Lady Macbeth as played by the actor Lila McCarthy. McCarthy is in a period costume. However, the letter that she is holding in this image does not resemble what a letter would have looked like in Shakespeare's time. McCarthy's piece of paper is large and very flat. In fact, it looks weirdly stiff, like it has been ironed. In contrast, the letters Shakespeare would have been familiar with in early modern England were smaller and had usually been folded multiple times so that the pages of the letter would have had visible creases all over them. In early modern England, letter writers did not use envelopes. Instead, the sheet of paper on which the letter was written would have been folded to form a packet, which would conceal the writing inside and have instructions written on the outside regarding its delivery. The postal service did not really exist at this time, so you'd have passed your letter packet to a trusted messenger to deliver the correspondence to its desired destination. The images on this slide show a letter written in around 1610, so only shortly after we believe Macbeth was written. The letter was written by Jane Skipwith to a man named Lewis Bagot. Skipwith begins the letter by writing, "My best beloved cousin," and the date is given near to the end of the letter on the left-hand side. On the back of the letter, she has written, "To my good friend Mr. Lewis Bagot, give this." Those are the instructions for delivering the letter. From the fold marks still visible on the page, you can see how this letter would have been folded up into pleats to form the small packet which is pictured on the right-hand side of this slide. You can still see the frayed ends of the floss string fixed into the wax seals on that packet. These strings would have looped around the letter packet to secure it. If the eventual recipient of the letter found that those strings and the seal had been broken or tampered with in some way, then they would have known that the letter had been intercepted and read by somebody else. Thus, letters in the early modern period were folded pieces of paper. Sometimes the letter writer would fold their letter once they had written it. Other times, writers appear to have folded the piece of paper before they even begun to write. The advantage of folding the page before beginning to write was that the folds would then provide guiding lines and a margin that could help you to maintain neat, straight lines in your own correspondence. I believe that it's helpful to have an understanding of how early modern letters looked and functioned when we reach Act 5, Scene 1 of Macbeth. This last act of the play opens with Lady Macbeth's gentlewoman explaining to a doctor that she has seen Lady Macbeth sleepwalking. The gentlewoman also explains that Lady Macbeth has been doing some writing during her nighttime wanderings. I'm going to ask you to pause the presentation again in a moment and to take 5 minutes to read through lines 1 to 9 of Act 5, Scene 1, which are printed on this slide. After you've finished reading, I want you to think about the following 2 questions. What is Lady Macbeth writing here? And why or to whom do you think she is writing it? I'm going to invite you to pause the presentation now for 5 minutes. You can pause the presentation or you can use the timer available on the slide. The literary critic Alan Stewart, who we met earlier in this seminar, has written about these lines in the play. Stewart writes, "It has been suggested that Lady Macbeth is here writing her will and testament, or a confession, both readings that foreground the role of conscience in the scene. But the reference to folding and sealing strongly implies that she is writing a letter, a reference to the letter that she is first seen reading aloud. It is only fitting that by the 5th act the letter is the stuff of nightmare, as Lady Macbeth takes on herself the terrible signs of guilt, conscience and remorse that Macbeth now lacks. As she folds, reads and seals the letter that once was his, but has to return it to her closet, never able to send on her guilt. And what was once Macbeth's writing, spoken in her voice, now becomes her writing, utterable to nobody." I find Stewart's analysis here really compelling, and I hope you do too. If Lady Macbeth is supposed to be writing a letter during this scene in the 5th act, then her nocturnal writing establishes a kind of narrative symmetry in the play. At the start of the drama, we meet her reading a letter, and at the end of the play she is glimpsed writing one. Perhaps Lady Macbeth's transition from reader to writer reflects a shift in her attitude. When she received Macbeth's letter in the first act of her play, her thoughts quickly turned to sin and action. But by this final act, she appears to be suffering under a guilty conscience. Are we supposed to feel sad for Lady Macbeth then? Certainly, there is something tragic about this image of a silent, nocturnal letter, which is sealed but never sent. Anyway, who would she send it to? Throughout the course of this seminar, I've been helping to strengthen your ability to visualise what Lady Macbeth's nighttime writing would have looked like. You can now picture this character's cluttered writing desk with its mess of quill and ink and pounce pot. You also know more about how letters were folded and sealed during this period. We've also thought about the semantics of letter writing and what it might mean for a literary character to write and read a letter. I'd urge you to bring this knowledge and analytical skill to bear upon your interpretations of Act 5, Scene 1, lines 1 to 9. How does it change your interpretation of these lines if you think that Lady Macbeth has been seen writing a letter during her nighttime wanderings? And what semantic role does this tragic image of the nocturnal letter writer play at this point in the play? But for now, we've reached the end of our session together today, and I really hope that you found this e-workshop interesting and thought-provoking. I also hope that you'll be inspired to use some elements of historical context in your own literary analysis, and to be on the lookout for texts within texts in your future literary studies. Look out for scenes of writing and reading and ask, what do these mean? On this slide of the presentation, I've included some suggestions of a few longer follow-up activities and tasks to complete. Today, I'd like to invite you to pick one or two of these tasks to complete. These will help to consolidate and build upon the work we've been doing together today. Also, on the slide that follows this one, I've included a bibliography and reading list with some ideas for further study. I'd really recommend looking up some of these books and following these links to learn more. But all that remains for me to say now is, thank you so much for your attention today. I really appreciate it. And I wish you all the very best of luck with your future studies, wherever they may take you.